The courtroom was quiet as a 45-year-old man sat across from his parents, not for inheritance or business, but because his father had taken legal action to force him out of the house he had lived in his entire life. The judge looked over the case file, and the details were simple but unsettling. The man had not worked in over 20 years, had no income, no independence, and had remained inside a multi-million-dollar home fully supported by his wealthy parents. His father and mother, both financially secure, were not asking for money. They were asking for their home back, their space back, their peace back. The father made it clear that he wanted the court to legally remove his own son from the property permanently. Then the son spoke, calm and without hesitation, as if nothing about the situation was unusual. He didn't deny anything, didn't argue the facts. Instead, he made a demand. If they wanted him out, they should pay him $50 million. The number hung in the air, not as a negotiation, but as a condition. He argued that his father had money, his mother had money, and if they truly wanted him gone, they could afford to pay for it. There was no reaction from his parents, only silence, the kind that comes when something inside a family has already broken beyond repair.
What was unfolding in that courtroom wasn't just a legal dispute. It was years of dependency, resentment, and control finally surfacing in one moment. And it didn't end there, because just days after that hearing, police would be called to the same house with no signs of forced entry and no evidence of an outsider. Only one reality waiting inside. Something had gone terribly wrong within that home, and before it was over, one of them would be dead. If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.
Long before the courtroom, the family had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. The father was successful, disciplined, and financially secure, a man who had spent decades building wealth and stability. The mother was just as established, and together they created a life of comfort inside a large, expensive home in a quiet neighborhood. There was no financial struggle, no visible hardship, and for years, everything appeared controlled and orderly. But inside that home, their son never left. At first, it didn't seem unusual. He stayed after finishing school, taking time to figure out his path, supported by parents who believed he would eventually find direction. Months turned into years, and years turned into decades. By the time he reached his mid-40s, nothing had changed. He had no job, no steady income, and no real independence. His life remained confined to the same house, the same routines, the same dependency. While his parents continued to build and maintain their wealth, he remained completely reliant on them for everything. Over time, the support that once came from care slowly turned into frustration.
Conversations about work became arguments, arguments became silence, and silence turned into distance. The father began to see not just a lack of effort, but a refusal to change. The mother, caught between them, tried to maintain peace, but the tension inside the house kept growing. What had once been a family home slowly became a place of quiet resentment, where every day felt the same and nothing moved forward. The father was getting older, and with that came a growing urgency to reclaim control of his life and his home. But the longer the situation continued, the more it became clear that this wasn't temporary. This was permanent. And beneath the surface of that wealthy, comfortable household, something was building, something shaped by years of dependency, entitlement, and unspoken anger that neither side could resolve.
The father had reached his limit. Years of patience had worn thin, and what once had been tolerance was now frustration bordering on anger. He made a decision he had hoped he would never have to make. He dragged his son to court to force him out of the house. The son, now 45, didn't react with fear or remorse. Instead, he remained calm, almost detached, as if he had expected this moment for years. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The father spoke plainly. He wanted his son out,
legally removed from the home that had been his parents' sanctuary for decades. The son, however, refused to simply leave. He claimed that leaving the house was not a matter of choice, but a matter of compensation. He demanded $50 million before he would consider relocating, arguing that both his father and mother had enough money to pay him for the privilege of leaving. The judge, the lawyers, and even the parents could barely process the audacity of the request. It wasn't just about entitlement. It was a deep-seated belief that he deserved to be paid for abandoning the life he had never tried to build. Arguments flared, words were exchanged, but the son's demand never wavered. Outside the courtroom, whispers began to spread. A family dispute had become a showdown, a battle of control and power within a wealthy household that should have been beyond such conflict. The father left the court that day knowing he had won the legal right to evict his son, but he also left with a creeping unease. The son had made his position clear, and the threat beneath his calm demeanor was unmistakable. What had once been frustration was now a powder keg. And inside that house, behind closed doors, the countdown to disaster had already begun. After the court hearing, the father returned home with a sense of relief, believing the legal battle had given him control over the situation. But the son had not left. For days he lingered in the mansion, moving through rooms with a quiet intensity that unsettled everyone. He spoke little, his gaze cold, his presence heavy. The mother tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but even she could feel the tension thickening, a pressure that made every corner of the house feel suffocating. Arguments flared over trivial things, food, chores, who sat where, and the air inside the home became electric, charged with unspoken threats. The father warned him repeatedly, trying to assert authority, but the son remained defiant, reminding them of his $50 million demand as though it were a shield against reality. Nights were the worst. The son would wander the halls late into the night, the ticking of the clocks echoing like a warning. Parents, wealthy and accustomed to control, began to feel powerless in their own home. What had been a life of comfort and luxury was now a battlefield. Friends and neighbors noticed unusual comings and goings, but no one could have predicted what was building behind those walls. Every passing hour, the sense of impending violence grew. The son, who had never worked, who had never left, was now poised on the edge of desperation. And the father, who had tried everything to reclaim his home and his life, could feel that his decision to take the son to court had lit a fuse that nothing could now extinguish. In that mansion, in those final days, the countdown had begun, and no one could stop what was coming. It was late at night when the tension that had been building for decades finally erupted. The house, once a symbol of wealth and comfort, had become a trap. Inside, the father confronted his son one last time, urging him to leave before it was too late. The son didn't argue, he barely spoke, but his eyes held a quiet menace, a simmering rage that had grown from years of dependency and resentment. Words escalated into shouting, and the shouting escalated into a confrontation neither could control. Neighbors later reported hearing nothing unusual. The sounds of struggle were contained within the walls of the mansion. When the police arrived hours later, there was no forced entry. Everything indicated the violence had come from inside. The father was found dead, the result of a sudden, brutal act that stunned investigators. The mother, devastated, could barely comprehend how the man she had trusted and loved could be taken from her in such a manner. The son was still present, or perhaps had only just left, but one truth was undeniable. The conflict that had simmered for decades, fueled by entitlement, wealth, and a refusal to change, had finally reached its deadly conclusion. What had started as a legal eviction request had turned into murder, leaving a wealthy household shattered and a community asking the same question. How did a family built on comfort and privilege collapse so violently from within? Police arrived at the mansion hours after the murder and immediately realized this was no ordinary crime. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an outsider. Everything pointed to someone inside the house. Investigators focused on the son almost immediately. They interviewed the mother, neighbors, and staff, piecing together a timeline of the final days. The court documents, which had just become public, revealed the eviction battle and the outrageous $50 million demand. Detectives began to see a pattern. Years of dependency, entitlement, and simmering resentment had created a volatile environment. Forensic evidence confirmed that the father had been attacked in a sudden, violent confrontation, leaving little doubt that the son had acted in the house he had lived in for decades. Friends and relatives described him as calm but detached, capable of hiding emotions until pushed too far. Motive was clear: eviction, humiliation, and the frustration of being denied what he believed he deserved. But investigators also saw something darker, a sense of entitlement that had turned deadly, a mind convinced that money and leverage could protect him from consequences. As the case unfolded, police realized this wasn't just a murder. It was the final, violent act in a long story of a family torn apart by wealth, dependency, and a refusal to accept reality. Every clue pointed to one fact: the man who had refused to leave the home had crossed a line that could never be undone. When the son was finally arrested and brought to trial, the courtroom was tense from the very first day. The prosecution painted a clear picture: a 45-year-old man, never employed for over 20 years, demanding $50 million to leave a home he did not own, culminating in the murder of his own father. Witnesses described years of resentment and dependency, and the mother testified about the fear and tension that had filled the mansion in the days leading up to the killing. The defense tried to argue mental instability, claiming that decades of living under strict parental control had affected his judgment, but the evidence was overwhelming. The court reviewed the timeline, the confrontation, and the prior threats. Every detail pointed back to the son's refusal to accept boundaries and his entitlement fueled by wealth he had never earned. Jurors listened as the prosecution laid out the chilling sequence: a confrontation that escalated, a family home turned crime scene, a father's life ended over decades of dependency and anger. The son remained calm throughout much of the proceedings, but the weight of his actions hung heavily in the air. Public reaction was divided. Some condemned him as a monster, others debated whether the father's decision to evict him had triggered the violence. But in the end, the verdict was clear. Guilt was undeniable. A life built on privilege, dependency, and entitlement had exploded into tragedy, leaving a wealthy household shattered and a community shocked that wealth could not shield a family from the darkest consequences of human behavior. After the verdict, the case faded from headlines, but the damage remained. The mansion that once symbolized wealth and control became a place no one wanted to speak about. The mother was left alone in the home that had witnessed the slow collapse of her family, now carrying the weight of both loss and memory. Friends described her as withdrawn, struggling to reconcile how a life built on comfort had ended in such violence. The son, once completely dependent on his parents, now faced the consequences of a decision that had destroyed everything. His demand for $50 million reduced to nothing against the reality of his actions. The court case sparked wider conversations about entitlement, parenting, and the dangers of prolonged dependency, with many questioning how a situation like this could go on for decades without intervention. Some believed the warning signs had been there all along, hidden behind wealth and silence, ignored until it was too late. Others argued that the moment the father took legal action, the outcome had already begun to take shape. What remained undeniable was that a family with every advantage had still fallen apart in the most irreversible way. In the end, the house stood as a reminder that money could provide comfort, but it could not fix what was broken inside. And behind closed doors, even the most stable lives can unravel with consequences no one can escape. If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.